AI almost didn't book the Lisbon hostel. The reviews were decent but not great. Someone had written staff is fine. Vibe is a little too social if you want quiet. And I remember thinking that sounded perfect. I was 26, freshly quit from a job I hated, and I wanted exactly that. Social, loud, strangers who didn't know anything about me. I checked in on a Tuesday evening in late October. The hostel was called something like Casa Verde, one of those narrow 4-story buildings in Alfama, the old district, where the streets are so tight two people can barely pass each other. The woman at the desk gave me a key card, pointed up a steep staircase, and said my dorm was room 6, bunk 3, 6-bed female dorm. I had 3 roommates already there when I arrived. A Dutch girl named something I immediately forgot, a pair of Korean travelers who were clearly together and spoke to each other exclusively. Nobody unfriendly, just that hostile standard polite nod that means I acknowledge you exist and I will not bother you. I liked it immediately. The common room was on the ground floor. Long wooden tables, a bar that sold cheap wine, fairy lights that someone had put up badly, so one corner was overlit and the rest was almost dark. There were maybe 15 people in there when I came down around 8 p.m. And that's when I first noticed him. He wasn't doing anything strange. That's the thing I keep coming back to. He was just present, sitting at the end of the long table with a beer, talking to a girl who'd clearly just arrived because her backpack was still on the chair beside her. He was American, somewhere in his early 30s, with one of those faces that's generically good-looking in a way that makes him hard to describe. Medium height, brown hair, wearing a gray Patagonia fleece like half the men in every hostel in Europe. He caught my eye and smiled. I smiled back. That was it. I had dinner, drank 2 glasses of wine, talked to a British couple who were cycling across Portugal, and went to bed around 11. Normal night. The next morning I came down for the free breakfast, bread, butter, that slightly sad jam in single-serve packets, and he was there again. Different girl this time, also looked freshly arrived. He was laughing at something she said, pouring her a coffee from the communal pot without being asked. Very easy, very natural. I didn't think anything of it. It was the 3rd morning that something shifted. I'd been at the hostel 4 nights by then, and I started to realize, not all at once, more like a slow focusing, the way your eyes adjust in a dark room, that I had never once seen him leave. Most people at a hostel are out constantly. That's the whole point. You dump your bag, you go explore, you come back to sleep. But every time I was in the common room, he was there. Every breakfast, every evening, and always, sitting with someone new. Someone who had that just-arrived look. Big backpack, slightly overwhelmed, alone. He came and talked to me on my 4th evening. I was sitting by myself reading, which in hostel language is a yellow light, not a red one. People still approach you, they just usually ask first. He didn't ask. He just sat down across from me, said, "Good book?" And when I looked up, he was already comfortable, like he'd been there a while. We talked for maybe 40 minutes. He was charming, funny in a low-key way. He asked good questions, not the standard hostel script of where are you from, how long are you traveling, but actual specific things. What neighborhood was I staying in next? Whether I'd been to the Moraria district yet. He said he knew a fado bar that wasn't in any guidebook. Real locals only, and he'd been wanting to go but hadn't found anyone to go with yet. And here is the thing that I think about now, the thing that took me weeks to fully name. He never once told me anything about himself. I couldn't tell you how long he'd been there. I couldn't tell you where he was going next. I asked, I think, twice, and both times he redirected so smoothly I didn't notice until later that he'd never actually answered. I said I was tired and went upstairs around 10. The Dutch girl, I'd learned her name was Femke by then, was already in bed reading. We'd started doing that thing where you talk quietly in a dark dorm room, the way you do when you're both a little lonely but too tired for real conversation. I mentioned the guy, said he'd been chatting me up. She went quiet for a second. Then she said, "How long have you been here?" "For nights," I said. "He was here when I arrived," she said. "That was 8 days ago." I sat with that. "He talked to me my first night," she said. "Offered to show me around." I said yes, and then I don't know. I woke up the next morning and something felt off and I made an excuse. I asked if anything had happened. "No," she said. "That's the thing. Nothing happened." She turned her lamp off. I lay there in the dark thinking about the new girl I'd seen him with that morning. She'd had a large red Osprey backpack. She looked maybe 22. She'd been laughing at something he said. The next morning she wasn't at breakfast. That might mean nothing. People leave early. People sleep in. People go out. But I found myself watching the door the whole time I was eating, and she didn't come down. I went to the front desk and I did something I still feel slightly embarrassed about because it felt so paranoid in the moment. I asked the woman behind the desk if the girl in room 4 had checked out. The woman looked at her screen, frowned slightly, said she didn't have a checkout for that room yet. I asked if she was still in the building. The woman gave me a look that was not unkind but was very clearly "Why are you asking me this?" and said she couldn't give out information about other guests. I went and sat in the common room and I waited. He came down at 9:30, alone, poured himself a coffee, checked his phone. Completely normal. At 10:15 the girl came downstairs with her big red backpack. She looked fine. Tired, maybe, in the way everyone looks at 10 in the morning in a hostel. She went to the desk. I heard her asking about late checkout. She didn't look distressed. She didn't look like anything had happened. And I know that should have made me feel better. It mostly did. But then he looked up from his phone and saw her, and he smiled, and she smiled back, and something in that exchange, the familiarity of it, the way his smile had this small private quality to it, like they were sharing something, made my stomach turn in a way I couldn't fully explain. I left the hostel that afternoon. I'd been planning to stay 2 more nights, but I packed my stuff up, told Femke I was moving on, and booked into a different place across the city. She hugged me. She didn't ask why. Here's what I've thought about since then. Because nothing actually happened to me. I want to be clear about that. He never touched me. He never followed me. He never said anything explicitly threatening. What he did was this: he stayed in one place and he let new people come to him, and he was warm and easy and attentive in a way that specifically targeted people who were alone and new and a little unmoored. And he did it over and over and over with a consistency that didn't look like socializing. It looked like a system. I don't know what he was doing. Maybe he was completely harmless and just genuinely liked meeting people and had some reason for staying in that hostel for weeks. Maybe he had a deal with the owner. Maybe he was lonely in a very mundane way. But I looked up the hostel's review page about 3 months later. I don't know what I was expecting. And I found a review from a woman who said she'd had a weird experience with another guest, and that the staff hadn't been helpful when she raised it. She didn't elaborate. The owner's response was a generic apology and a line about how they take guest comfort seriously. The review was from a different year than my visit. I've told this story a few times, and most people's reaction is some version of, well, nothing happened, so. And that's fair. But the thing that stays with me isn't what he might have done. It's how long he'd clearly been doing it, whatever it was. The patience of it. The way he'd built a whole routine around access to people who were temporarily untethered from everything familiar. That's not loneliness. That's practice. And the last thing, the detail I always almost forget to mention because it still seems almost too small to matter. When I was leaving, I passed through the common room one final time with my bag. He was at the long table again. New girl beside him, backpack still on. He was pouring her a coffee. He looked up when I walked past. He gave me that same easy smile. And then he looked back at her. The first thing I noticed about the hostel was that it was too far from everything. The listing had described it as 30 minutes from Chiang Mai city center, which in practice meant a 45-minute Songtho ride down a road that got progressively narrower, past rice fields and a petrol station that looked permanently closed, until you reached a wooden gate with a hand-painted sign that I couldn't read. My driver pointed at it and said the name of the hostel. I got out. He left immediately, which I remember thinking was slightly odd. Usually they wait to make sure you've found the right place. The hostel itself was actually beautiful. That's the part that always makes people pause when I tell this. It wasn't some grim concrete block. It was a converted traditional house, dark teak wood, a wide porch with hammocks, fruit trees in the garden. Someone had put real thought into it. There were fairy lights strung between the trees and a small outdoor kitchen where a woman was cooking something that smelled incredible. 2 other guests were in the hammocks reading. It looked like the kind of place that ends up on travel blogs under headlines like Hidden Gem and Off the Beaten Path. I checked in and was given dorm bed number 4 in a 6-bedroom. The woman who checked me in warm, efficient, limited English but enough, told me dinner was included and served at 7. The night manager would be on from 10. I had dinner, met the 2 hammock people, a Belgian guy and an Australian woman who'd been there 3 days already and were clearly in that holiday stasis where you stop counting. Good food. Someone had a guitar. It was genuinely lovely. I went to bed around 11. That was when I met the night manager. I'd gotten up to use the bathroom, which was at the end of a short corridor outside the dorm. The main lights were off, but there were small floor-level lights along the corridor, enough to see by. I patted down in socks and pushed open the bathroom door, and he was standing just inside it. Not using it, just standing, facing the door like he'd heard me coming. He was probably 50, thin in that angular way, with very close-cropped gray hair. He was wearing a dark shirt with the Hostel's small embroidered logo on the chest pocket. He looked at me completely without surprise, like I was the one who'd walked into his space, and said something in Thai that I didn't understand. I said sorry, so sorry, wrong door maybe. I was already backing out. And he said in English, very flat, "Bathroom is correct." I was checking the pipes. There were no pipes visible. It was a small bathroom, toilet, sink, shower stall. He walked past me into the corridor without another word and disappeared toward the reception end of the building. I used the bathroom with the door locked and lay awake for a while afterward, but I talked myself down. Maintenance things happen at night. Lost in translation. I was in an unfamiliar place and my brain was doing what brains do. By the next morning, I'd mostly let it go. Then small things started. At breakfast he was there, which I hadn't expected. I thought the night manager would be off by morning. Standing near the kitchen, not eating, just present. When I came down, he looked at me and said, again in that flat effect, "You slept well. You came in at 2 a.m. I hadn't come in at 2 a.m. I'd been in the dorm since before midnight. I'd gone out briefly after dinner to sit on the porch, maybe until 11:30. I said I thought I'd been in earlier than that. He shrugged. The gate log shows 2 a.m. I didn't push it, but I thought about it all day. There was a gate log, a simple digital pad on the wooden gate where you scanned your keycard in and out. Fine. Normal security. But I knew what time I'd come in. And the fact that he'd checked it and that he'd brought it up at breakfast casually like it was just conversation, that sat wrong in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. The Belgian guy, when I mentioned it later, laughed and said the night manager was a bit of a character and had told him the exact same thing one morning. Told him when he'd come in where he'd sat in the common room how long he'd been on his phone. He seemed to think it was funny in a slightly nervous way. The Australian woman had stopped engaging with the night manager entirely after her second day. She didn't say why and I didn't ask. That evening I went back to my dorm earlier than usual. I'd been reading on the porch and I came inside around 9:30. The dorm was empty. Everyone else was still out. I was changing out of my day clothes when I noticed something on the wall near my bunk. It was small. If the light hadn't caught it at the angle it did, I would never have seen it. A small dark circle, roughly level with the top of my bunk. In the wall that separated the dorm from what I assumed was a storage space or utility area, perfectly round, about the diameter of a pen. A hole. I stood there for a moment. Then I put my thumb over it. Then I moved my bunk slightly, just a few centimeters, so it wasn't aligned with where I slept. I told myself it could be anything. An old hook removed, a knot in the wood, ventilation in older teak construction, which I don't actually know is a thing, but I wanted it to be. I didn't sleep well. The next morning I did something deliberate. I went to the reception area while the day staff woman was on. Not him, and I asked, as casually as I could manage, what was on the other side of the wall adjacent to dorm room 4. She looked slightly confused by the question and said it was the manager's private office and storage. I asked if the night manager used that office. She paused just a beat too long before saying yes, sometimes, for paperwork. I went back to the dorm and looked at the hole again in daylight. It was positioned precisely. Not a knot. Not a random gap. The angle of it, if you looked straight through, would have faced the row of bunks directly. I didn't look through it. I didn't want to know if there was light on the other side. I packed that afternoon. I told the day staff woman I had a change of plans and needed to leave early. She was apologetic, offered a partial refund, was completely normal about it. When I was loading my bag into a taxi I'd called, an actual metered taxi this time, I was not getting in a Songthaw alone. I looked back at the porch. He was standing there, not doing anything, arms at his sides, watching me get into the cab with an expression that was entirely neutral, which somehow made it worse than if he'd looked angry or caught out. Just watching, like this was something he'd seen happen before, like he knew exactly why I was leaving and it didn't concern him much. I reported it. I want to say that clearly because when I've told the story people always ask and seem vaguely relieved when I say yes. I went to a tourist police office in Chiang Mai and I told them what I'd found. The officer I spoke to was polite and wrote things down and told me they would look into it. He asked if I'd taken a photo of the hole. I hadn't. He nodded in a way that told me what that meant for the report. I looked the hostel up about 2 months later. Still operating. Still getting mostly positive reviews. One review, buried in the middle of a long list, from a solo female traveler who said the night staff had made her uncomfortable, and she'd felt like she didn't have full privacy in the dorm. She'd given it 2 stars. The owner's response said they were sorry she'd felt that way and that guest privacy was their top priority. The reply had been posted within an hour of the review going up. That's the part one come back to. Not the whole, as disturbing as that is, holes can theoretically be explained. What I think about is the knowledge. The specific, detailed, unnecessary knowledge he had. What time you came in. How long you sat in the common room. Which locker you used. That level of attention doesn't come from checking a gate log once. That's someone who has built a practice around watching people who don't know they're being watched. And the thing about a hostel, the thing that makes it so specifically vulnerable, is that everyone there is temporary. Everyone is passing through. Nobody knows each other. If something happens to you, there's no one around who would notice quickly. Your family doesn't know the name of the town. Your friends don't have the address. You checked in under your passport number and you'll check out in 3 days and the next person will take your bunk and the cycle just continues. He knew that. I think that was the whole point. The hostel is still listed on 3 major booking sites. The photos are beautiful. The teak wood, the hammocks, the fairy lights in the fruit trees. In the outdoor kitchen shot, if you look at the background, slightly out of focus near the treeline, there's a figure standing very still. I noticed it the first time I looked at the listing, back when I was excited about booking it. I didn't register it then. I register it now. We almost didn't notice him at first, which is the part that bothers me most when I look back on it. It was Prague, early March, the kind of cold that gets into the hostel walls and stays there no matter how high the radiator runs. My friend and I had been traveling together for about 2 weeks by then, Budapest, Vienna, now Prague, and we were hitting that point in a long trip where everything starts blurring together. New city, same routine. Find the hostel, find the cheap dinner place, find the bar that doesn't card aggressively. Repeat. The hostel was in Žižkov, which is the less polished district, not the pretty postcard part of Prague with the bridge and the clock tower. Graffiti on most walls. A tram line that ran directly outside the window. The building itself was an old apartment block converted badly. The ceilings were too low, the corridors were too narrow, and everything smelled faintly of a cleaning product that wasn't quite covering something else underneath. We were in a 10-bed dorm on the 3rd floor. Room 9. Our bunks were numbers 3 and 4, side by side against the left wall. He was in bunk 7. Bunk 7 was diagonally across from mine, near the window that faced the tram line. He was already there when we checked in, lying on top of his covers, fully dressed, facing the ceiling. He turned his head when we came in and gave a small nod. Pale, dark circles, the kind of tired that looks structural, like it's been there a while. He was wearing dark trousers and a gray knit sweater that looked slightly too big for him. We nodded back and started unpacking. Normal dorm behavior. But that evening he was in the common room when we came down, and he was easy to talk to in a quiet way. Not loud, not performing, just present. He spoke English well, with an accent I couldn't fully place. Somewhere Eastern European, maybe, but softened somehow. He didn't give his name. We didn't give ours. That happens sometimes in hostels. You have a full conversation with someone and names just never come up. He'd been in Prague a while, he said. Longer than planned. He mentioned a cafe near the Vltava where the coffee was good and they left you alone. He mentioned a bookshop with a cat that sat in the window. Specific details, the kind that feel earned rather than Googled. He seemed to know the city the way you only know a place after weeks of walking it aimlessly. We had drinks with him that night. Cheap Czech lager, $2.50 a glass. He was good company in a melancholy sort of way, like someone who was intelligent and a little sad and wasn't trying to hide either. We talked about the city, about travel, about nothing much. Around midnight he said he was going up and he left quietly. My friend said, walking back to the dorm, "He's interesting." I agreed. That was our first night. Over the next 2 days it became a kind of routine. We'd go out during the day, come back in the afternoon, and he'd either be in the dorm or the common room. We'd talk in the evenings. He recommended things. A market, a park on a hill with a view that wasn't in any guidebook, a bar down an unmarked staircase that turned out to be genuinely one of the best bars I've ever been in. He was always right about the recommendations. That's another thing I keep thinking about. He never joined us during the day. When we asked once if he wanted to come to the market he'd told us about, he said he didn't really go out much during the day. Said it lightly, no explanation. We didn't push it. On the third evening I noticed his shelf. Each bunk had a small shelf at head height, the kind with a lip on it so things don't slide off during the night. Most people's shelves had the usual clutter. Phone charger, water bottle, earplugs, a book. His shelf had nothing on it. No phone that I ever saw. No charger. No bag anywhere near the bunk. No shoes under the bed. I noticed it and then I let it go because people travel strangely sometimes. Minimalist packers exist. Maybe his stuff was in a locker. We checked out on a Thursday morning. Early because we had a bus to Berlin at noon. We were the first ones up in the dorm, everyone else still asleep or absent, and I looked across at bunk 7 while I was packing and it was empty. Made, or more accurately undisturbed. The thin hostel duvet pulled flat and tucked in at the corners the way it would have been when the cleaning staff did it. Not slept in looking. Just empty. I assumed he'd left early. Downstairs at checkout the woman behind the desk was processing our payment and I said, genuinely just making conversation, something like, "The guy in bunk 7, the quiet one, has he been here long?" She looked up from the screen. "Bunk 7. Yes," I said. "Dark sweater. Pale. Eastern European maybe." She shook her head slowly. Not in a "I don't remember him" way. In a "that's not possible" way. She turned the monitor slightly toward us and pointed at the screen. Room 9, 10 beds, current occupancy. Bunk 7 was listed as vacant. She scrolled back through the booking history. She did this without us asking, which tells me our faces must have said something. And bunk 7 had been listed as unoccupied for the entire duration of our stay. No booking, no check-in record, no key card issued for that bunk. My friend said, "That's not right, we talked to him for 3 days." The woman looked at us with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not skeptical exactly, more careful. She said she was sorry but there was no record of anyone in that bunk and suggested maybe he'd been using it without booking. It happened sometimes, people moved bunks without telling reception, swapped with someone. But even then he would have shown up in the room's occupancy record and he didn't. We stood there for a moment. I asked if there were security cameras in the common room. She said yes, but only the manager could access footage and he wasn't in until the afternoon. We had a bus to catch. We left. On the bus my friend and I went through everything we could remember. 3 evenings of conversation. Specific details, the cafe name, the bookshop, the bar down the staircase. I pulled up my phone and searched for the cafe he'd described and it existed, exactly as he'd described it, which somehow made it stranger rather than less strange. The bar down the staircase existed too. The bookshop with the cat in the window. None of that required him to be a real guest. None of it required him to be staying there at all. Here's the thing about a 10-bed dorm when you're a couple of tired travelers moving through a city. You don't actually verify anything. You see a person in a bunk and your brain files them under fellow guest without checking. You don't think to wonder why you never saw them come in from outside with cold air on their jacket. You don't think to wonder why they were never at breakfast. You don't think about the shelf with nothing on it or the absence of any luggage anywhere near that corner. You just talk to them in the evenings and feel like you've made one of those transient travel friendships, and then you leave. What bothers me, and this bothers me differently than the other things that bother me about it, is the recommendations. The cafe, the bar, the park on the hill. All real, all good. All the kind of local knowledge that requires either extensive research or actually living somewhere for a while. Whoever he was, he knew that city. About a week after we got to Berlin, my friend sent me a message late at night. No context, just a link to a review page for the hostel in Žižkov. She'd found a review from about 8 months before our visit, from a solo traveler, a woman traveling alone. The review was mostly positive, cheap, central enough, good atmosphere. In the middle of it, almost as an aside, she'd written, "There was a strange man in the dorm who didn't seem to be a real guest. Not sure if he worked there or what, but he was there every night. Staff didn't seem to know who he was when I asked." 2 sentences. Then she moved on to talking about the breakfast. The review had 4 upvotes. No response from the hostel. I typed the details into a couple of travel forums looking for similar accounts, and I found one, maybe from a different hostel in the same district. Someone describing a quiet guy who seemed to live in the common room, who nobody could account for, who disappeared before checkout. It might be unrelated. Different hostel, different person, different year. But the district was the same. We never found out who he was. I've thought about the explanations. Someone who'd made an arrangement with a staff member to sleep their off-books. Someone with nowhere else to go who'd found a way to exist in the margins of a place with high turnover and minimal oversight. Someone who specifically sought out travelers to talk to for reasons I don't want to think about too carefully. The most unsettling explanation is also the simplest one. A hostel is a place where people arrive constantly and leave constantly, and nobody knows anybody, and the one thing everyone has in common is that nobody is checking. Nobody is verifying. You're all just passing through, and you trust by default that the person in the bunk across from you is doing the same thing you are. It's a reasonable assumption. It's just not always correct. The bookshop with the cat is still there. I looked it up. Still has good reviews. The cat is apparently named something I won't try to spell. Somewhere out there, maybe in a hostel dorm right now, is someone sitting in a low-lit common room recommending it to a traveler who just checked in. And nobody at the front desk has any record of him being there. The first time it happened, I genuinely laughed.
Berlin in November.
I'd been there 4 days, solo, staying in a mid-sized hostel in Mitte, the kind of place that's professionally run enough to feel safe but worn enough to feel authentic. 40 beds across multiple dorms, a common room with mismatched furniture, and a record player nobody used. A small bar that closed at 1. I was in a 6-bed dorm, bunk 2, and I had the bottom bunk, which always feels like a small victory when you're tired. The laugh happened on my second evening. I'd spent the afternoon walking, ended up in a bar in Prenzlauer Berg completely by accident. Just ducked in because it was raining, and they were playing a song I hadn't heard in years. An old Portishead track, the one off the second album, not the famous one. Obscure enough that I remember thinking it was a strange choice for a bar playlist. I stayed for 2 drinks. The rain stopped. I left. That evening I came back to the hostel and went down to the common room around 9. The record player that nobody used was on. Same song. Exact same Portishead track. The same one, playing through a crackling vinyl that someone had apparently found in the collection of records stacked under the player. I laughed because it was a funny coincidence. One of those small universe is a simulation moments that you text to someone and they reply LOL, that's so weird, and then everyone moves on. I moved on. The second time was the following afternoon. I'd gone to a gallery in Mitte, contemporary stuff, free entry on Tuesdays, and on my way out I passed a man on the front steps who was reading. Just sitting on the steps with a paperback, waiting for someone probably. Medium build, dark coat, a red canvas tote bag from what looked like an independent bookshop. Nothing notable about him whatsoever. 2 hours later, I was in a completely different part of the city, a market in Neukölln I'd read about in a blog post. And he was there. Same dark coat, same red tote bag, now with something in it. He was looking at a stall selling second-hand cameras. I noticed him because of the bag specifically. It was an unusual shade of red, more terracotta than true red, and the bookshop logo on it was in a font I'd half registered on the gallery steps. So I noticed. I didn't approach him. Why would I? Coincidences happen in cities. Berlin is big, but neighborhoods have their own circuits. People move through the same spaces. I filed it away and kept walking. That night I sat in the hostel common room writing in my journal. I keep one when I travel, physical notebook, nothing digital. And I had this low-level, unsettled feeling I couldn't name. Not fear. More like the feeling you get when you're sure you've forgotten something but you can't remember what. That specific low hum of something not quite resolved. I went to bed and I slept fine, and I told myself I was doing what solo travelers do when they spend too much time in their own heads, which is find patterns in static. The third thing happened on day 4, and this is the one I can't explain away no matter how many times I try. The hostel had a communal journal. Lots of hostels do. A notebook left in the common room where guests write things. Recommendations, observations, jokes, drawings. The idea is that it builds up over time into this record of everyone who passed through. This one was a thick hardcover, half full, going back about 2 years based on the dates people occasionally wrote. I'd flipped through it on my first night, the way you do. Skimming. Reading a recommendation here, a funny entry there. Standard stuff. On day 4, afternoon, I was in the common room waiting for my laundry, and I picked it up again. Started from the back this time, reading more recent entries. And about 15 pages from the end, I found one that stopped me completely. It was undated. No name. Written in neat, small handwriting in blue pen. It said, approximately, and I'm working from memory here, but I have gone over this so many times that I'm confident in the substance of it. It said something like, arrive tired, the walk from the U-Bahn is longer than it looks on the map. Spent the first afternoon getting rained on in Prenzlauer Berg. Ended up in a bar by accident. Went to the gallery on Tuesday for the free entry. The market in Neukölln on Wednesday was worth it despite the cold. Leaving Thursday feeling like Berlin got under my skin in a way I didn't expect. The city watches you back. I read it 3 times. Then I sat there with the journal open in my lap for probably 5 minutes, not entirely sure what I was feeling. Because here is the thing. Those were my days. That was my trip. Prenzlauer Berg, rain, bar by accident. Gallery, free Tuesday entry. Neukölln market on Wednesday. I was leaving Thursday. Every detail landed correctly. The only explanation I could construct in that moment was that someone had been in the hostel at the same time as me, moving through the same city in almost identical patterns, and had written it up before I had.
Parallel Travela.
Same blog recommendations, same instincts, same itinerary. It happens. But the entry was dry to the touch. The ink had that faint dull look that ink gets when it's been on a page for a while. Not the slight sheen of something written recently. And the pages around it, I checked, I couldn't help it, had dates from 6 weeks ago. I went to the front desk and asked about the journal. The guy on duty, young, ear-piercing, tired in the pleasant way of someone on a long shift, said guests left entries all the time and they didn't monitor it. I asked when the last entry had been written. He shrugged, said he didn't really check. I went back and looked at the entry again. And this time I noticed something I'd missed the first time. The last line, after the city watches you back. Below it, in slightly smaller writing, like an afterthought added later, bunk 2 is the best one. Bottom. I was in bunk 2. Bottom. I closed the journal and put it back on the shelf and went and sat very still in a chair for a while. Here is every rational explanation I have constructed since then. Someone stayed in that bunk recently, followed a similar tourist path through the same recommended spots, wrote it up, and the ink age is something I misread because I'm not a document examiner. The bunk comment is coincidence. Bunk 2 bottom is a good bunk, and others have noted it before. The song played twice because Portishead is more common on Berlin bar playlists than I realized, and the hostel's vinyl collection happened to include the same album. The man with the red bag lives in or near both neighborhoods and was simply out both times I was. Every one of those explanations is plausible. I've stress-tested all of them. But here's the problem with explaining away a cluster of coincidences. The explanations have to work simultaneously, not just individually. Each one is plausible alone. All of them together across 4 days in a sequence that kept tightening rather than dispersing, that's a different calculation. That's not one coincidence. That's a coincidence that kept having coincidences. I changed my checkout to the following morning instead of Thursday afternoon. I didn't post about Berlin on social media while I was there, which I'd been doing throughout the trip. I didn't write in my journal that night. I have thought about whether someone was watching me, following me, tracking my movements, deliberately constructing the moments I've described. It's possible. I can't rule it out, but it requires a level of sustained, purposeful effort that strains credibility, and more importantly, it requires a reason that I can't identify.
I'm a solo traveler.
I have no money, no notoriety, nothing that would make me a target for that kind of orchestrated attention. The alternative is that none of it was directed at me, that the world occasionally does this, stacks coincidences in a column until they start to look like a message, and the only thing that was truly happening was that I was alone and attentive and slightly untethered from routine, and my brain was doing what isolated human brains do when they have too much time and too little certainty. That's probably the correct explanation, but I took a photo of that journal entry before I left. I have it on my phone. I've looked at it maybe a dozen times since. The handwriting is neat and regular, and the ink does look old, and the words say exactly what I remember them saying. And the very last thing I did before leaving that common room on my last morning was pick up the journal one more time and flip to that page. Someone had added a new line below the one about bunk 2. Same pen, same handwriting. It just said, "Hope you enjoyed it." No date, no name. I stood there with the journal open, and the common room was empty, and the record player was off, and the morning light was coming in through the east-facing window at a low, flat angle. I put the journal down. I did not look to see if anyone was watching me put it down. I picked up my bag and I left, and I did not look back, and I have not been back to Berlin since, which is a shame because honestly, despite everything, it really did get under my skin in a way I didn't expect. The city watches you back. We met them at the rooftop bar, and everything about it felt like exactly the kind of night you travel for. Cartagena in late September is the kind of heat that doesn't break at night. It just shifts, becomes wetter somehow, the air thicker after dark than during the day. The hostel I was staying in was a converted colonial building in Getsemani, the artsy district just outside the walled city. Painted walls, mosaic floors, a courtyard with a ceiling fan that moved the air around without cooling it. I'd been there 2 nights already. Solo. The plan was 4 nights total and then a flight back. The rooftop was a common area, open to guests, with a bar that operated on an honesty system. You marked your drinks on a clipboard and settled at checkout. I'd gone up around 8 with a book I wasn't really reading, more using as a social prop, and that's where I encountered them. 6 of them. Mixed nationalities from what I gathered in the first few minutes. 2 who spoke to each other in what sounded like Dutch. 1 with an Australian accent, 2 others whose accents I couldn't place, and 1 who spoke very little but smiled constantly. They were loud in the easy way of people who've been traveling together long enough to have inside jokes, but not long enough to be sick of each other. Somewhere in that sweet spot, they pulled me in immediately. Not aggressively. There was no single moment where I was recruited. It was more that the circle just widened slightly when I sat nearby, and suddenly I was inside it. Someone handed me a drink without asking if I wanted one. Someone else asked where I was from. And within 20 minutes I was laughing at something and had completely stopped pretending to read. We decided to go out. The decision was collective, the way group decisions in hostels always are. Not a vote, just a momentum that builds until leaving feels like the obvious next thing. Someone knew a bar near the walled city, a local's place, not on any app. We walked there in a loose group, the streets still warm, music coming from several directions at once the way it does in that part of Cartagena at night. The bar was real and it was good. Small, loud, merengue from a speaker in the corner, cold beer that came in bottles with the labels half peeled. We took up a long table near the back, and the drinks kept arriving, and the conversation was the fast, loose kind that only happens between strangers who know they'll never see each other again. Around 10:30 I went to the bathroom, and when I came back the seating had shifted slightly. Not dramatically, just rearranged. The 2 Dutch speakers had moved to either end of the table. The Australian was now sitting directly across from my chair rather than 2 seats down. The one who smiled constantly was now beside the door. I sat back down and didn't think about it. It was maybe 20 minutes later that I realized I wanted to move to the bar. I'd spotted a local woman I'd briefly met at a market that afternoon and wanted to say hello. And when I stood up, the Australian said immediately, not loudly, almost gently, Don't go anywhere. We're about to order another round. It was a completely normal thing to say. I sat back down. The round arrived. More conversation. The Australian was funny, genuinely funny, and kept directing jokes at me specifically, which felt like warmth at the time. I was being included. That's what it felt like. But sometime around 11:30, I clocked something that I can't unclock. There was another solo traveler at the bar. A woman who'd been there when we arrived, sitting on a stool, clearly also alone, doing the same book as prop thing I'd been doing earlier. At some point, I'd noticed her glance toward our table in the way solo travelers recognize each other. At one point, she'd made brief eye contact with me, and there was that small nod, the solo traveler acknowledgement. Now she was gone. And one of the group, one of the two whose accents I couldn't place, was standing near the stool where she'd been sitting, talking to the bartender. His body language was relaxed, conversational. But he was standing exactly where she'd been, in the narrow space between her stool and the exit, and he'd been standing there for a while. I looked around the bar. She was nowhere. I looked at the door. The smiling one was still beside it. He hadn't moved in at least an hour. I looked at the ends of the table. The Dutch speakers were still anchoring each end, and I understood, not consciously, more like something moving through me below the level of thought, that I was in the middle. I was between them. I had been between them for a while. The Australian said something and everyone laughed, and I laughed too, because what else do you do when you are sitting in the middle of 6 people you met 4 hours ago and something has shifted in the architecture of the evening in a way you can feel but cannot point to? Nobody had threatened me. Nobody had raised their voice. Nobody had touched me. They were just arranged. I picked up my phone and opened it like I was checking a message. I typed a text to nobody, just words, meaningless, to make my hands look busy. And then I opened my Maps app and looked at where the hostel was relative to where I was sitting. 12 minutes on foot. The route went through 3 well-lit streets before one darker stretch near the edge of Gethsemane. I put the phone down, picked up my drink, laughed at something. Then I said, I need to call my friend. She's waiting for me. 2 seconds. I had no friend. There was no one waiting. And I stood up and walked not toward the door by the table, where the smiling one was still standing, but toward the bar, because the bar had a side exit I'd clocked when we arrived. A narrow door that led to a service alley that connected to the main street. The Australian said, Your drink's still here. I said, 1 second. I walked to the bar and I kept walking, and I went through the side door and I was in the alley and I walked fast. Not running. Running attracts attention, and also running means you know you're running. But fast, and I came out onto the main street and I turned toward the walled city where there were people and lights, and I did not stop moving for 6 solid minutes. Nobody followed me, or if they did, I didn't see it. I got back to the hostel and sat in the courtyard for a long time with the ceiling fan moving the wet air around. The woman at the small front desk looked at me and said nothing, which I was grateful for. I went to my room and pushed the small luggage rack against the door. It wouldn't stop anyone, but it would make noise. And I lay on top of the covers in my clothes until about 4 in the morning, when I finally fell asleep. I left the next morning. One night early. I've turned the evening over so many times trying to find the version of it where I was wrong. Where they were just a group of friendly travelers who happened to arrange themselves in a way that looks, in retrospect, like something it wasn't. Where the solo woman at the bar just left of her own accord and her absence meant nothing. Where the smiling one standing by the door was just a person who stands by doors. Maybe that's the correct version. Maybe I paid $12 for 4 beers and walked home quickly because I'd spooked myself over nothing. But here is the thing about a threat that never becomes explicit, about a situation that stays just below the threshold of something you can name or report or describe to someone without sounding paranoid. You can't prove it. You can't unknow it either. What I know is that 6 people positioned themselves around me in a specific geometry and kept me in the center of it for over an hour, and every time I moved toward an edge, something redirected me back in. Gently, socially, the way you move a glass away from the edge of a table without making a big deal of it. I was the glass. The other thing I know, the detail that makes me most certain I wasn't imagining the shape of the evening, is that when I walked through the side door of that bar, the last thing I saw before the door closed behind me was the Australian. He wasn't looking at the table. He wasn't laughing. He was already watching the door I was walking through. He'd known before I moved. That's 5 stories. 5 real hostels, 5 different kinds of wrong. And if any part of you is sitting there thinking I've felt that low-frequency wrongness, that moment where a place or a person tips slightly off axis and you can't explain why, trust that feeling. The people in these stories who got out did so because they trusted it. This has been Unheard Fears. If these stories found you at midnight with your headphones in, you already know you're one of us. Subscribe, stay close, and we'll see you in the next one, if the lights stay on.